It's my pleasure to introduce my brother-in-law, Associate Professor Eitan Hersh, who has an expertise in American politics, and he's currently an Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science and Associate Professor of Civic Studies at Tufts Tisch College, with a focus on American politics. He studies civic participation, voting rights, and the relationship between election rules, strategies, and the behavior of voters, and he works a lot with big data. His first book was entitled Hacking the Electorate, and his most recent book is a book called Politics is for Power, How to Move Beyond Political Hobbyism, Take Action, and Make Real Change. Personally speaking, it's also, he's really smart, but what's also really nice is he's also a wonderful brother-in-law, a wonderful friend, a great Ava, and it's a shame that we can't get together for Pesach, but at least we have the opportunity to learn together through this medium. And it's my pleasure to turn the mic over to Eitan. I'll go ahead and unmute you so you can share your wisdom and teaching with the rest of the Temple Emanu-El community.
Thank you for having me, Rabbi Phil.
This feels like Chris Cuomo. This feels very Chris Cuomo, Andrew Cuomo. This is...
Call your mother. Call your mother. It's good to see so many familiar faces here. I've done a few of these now. Zoom talks about the book, but I don't think any with as many people I know already or who are members of my family. This is exciting. So let me, for those of you who have never heard my spiel before, let me talk for, I don't know, maybe 10 or 15 minutes about the book, and then hopefully provoke some questions or comments, or in the case of family members, criticisms of all kinds. And we can have a conversation. Michael, remind me, how long do we have together?
As long as we're ready before the morning Shema. That's the big concern, where we want to make sure we're ready for the morning Shema. These things usually go till about 45 minutes or so.
Great, okay. So thank you again for having me. So let me just give you a bit of an overview about what I've been working on and writing about. And that starts with me taking a bit of a departure from most of my work. Most of my work is basically doing strictly statistical analysis and hypothesis testing. But I wanted to take a different view. I want to see what we could come up with as a theory of what people are doing when they're doing politics. So like if we add up all the time that Americans spend on politics, what does it amount to? And the answer that I came up with was that it doesn't amount to very much. It was a bit of a heartbreaking conclusion that if you know, most people who are spending time on politics, and about a third of the country is spending an hour or 2 hours every day engaged in politics, somehow it's almost all news consumption and online engagement and partisan cheerleading and maybe the occasional form of activism from the couch. And I don't mean during coronavirus, I mean like before coronavirus. And people are not really engaging in what we might call actual political participation. So like, what is political participation? Political participation is working in groups with goals and strategies to influence the government. You might influence the government by trying to get other people to vote the way you want to vote, or you might influence the government by talking to politicians. Either way, you're working with others with some goals and some strategies to influence government. But that doesn't really describe how about 90% of people who are really engaged in politics, what they're doing. So what are they doing instead? They're really doing stuff to satisfy their own emotional and intellectual interests in politics. It's an attempt to feel connected to important things going on in the world. So if you think about news consumption, which is how most people spend most of their time on politics, if you think about news consumption, we're not really learning news, most of us, that helps us be active citizens. So if you ask a news junkie, the person who spends 2 hours a day, maybe on cable news or on Facebook and Twitter, if you ask them like, how can I get involved in Providence, in being, in some issue I care about, in climate change, in economic development, the news junkie usually blushes and says, you misunderstand. I don't follow any of the news that could actually help you answer that question, but I can tell you a lot about the Mueller report and the impeachment trial and all sorts of stuff happening in Washington. And in fact, the demographic of college-educated Americans has done this the most. As we've shifted our news consumption from offline to online, from TV news and newspapers to online, we've replaced all of our local news sources with national ones. So if you look at the charts of the number of people subscribed to the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, it's like off the charts. The New York Times subscribers had doubled or tripled since just the Trump election. Meanwhile, all the local news is going away, if not gone. So our news consumption really isn't gauged towards learning stuff that could help us participate in politics. If you look at voting, we have this very strange thing in American politics, which is that we vote most when it matters the least. So in Rhode Island or Massachusetts, of course, we'll have very high turnout in the presidential election, which because of the Electoral College won't have any real impact, right? Rhode Island and Massachusetts, these states are gonna go to the Democrat, no matter who it is, by 30 points. But nevertheless, this is where we're most active, right? So if I'm thinking back to say 2008, a lot of you remember this is sort of a high point on the Democratic side. Not only was there extremely high turnout among voters of all ages, but there was also a lot of activism, people getting on buses to New Hampshire, people donating. Even though in places like Rhode Island, Massachusetts, the election wasn't going to be close. Then, not just a few months later in Massachusetts, you might remember we had a big special election in Massachusetts because Ted Kennedy had died and there was a replacement. And this was a very important election, not just for Massachusetts, but for the country, because the Democrats controlled 60 votes in the United States Senate. And that filibuster-proof number was on the line. But what happened in this very democratic state of Massachusetts? Turnout plummeted, particularly in Democratic areas. And people stayed home. They stayed home in the 2010 elections on the Democratic side across the board. In 2010, the young people like under 30 only made up about 10% of the electorate, even though just a couple years before in 2008, they made up 20% of the electorate. And you see that on the Democratic side, what happened is when there was a celebrity candidate, Barack Obama, on the ballot, people were energized and willing to vote. When Obama wasn't on the ballot, the elections might be more boring. The state and local stuff doesn't seem that appetizing. And there was no celebrity, and Democrats stayed home. Meanwhile, the Tea Party was big. And then, of course, after the Republicans have their celebrity candidate on the ballot, after, not before, after, now the Democrats get energized about elections through indivisible groups and such, and a lot of news consumption. And meanwhile, the Tea Party groups go away. So we see as a politics that's really following a celebrity, national-oriented focus. What about activism? So anyone know the most common form of activism in American politics today? Any takers, suggestions? What's the most common form of activism?
Voting.
Besides voting.
Letter writing?
Petition signing, particularly online petition signing. Okay, that's the most common form of activism. And let me tell you a story. A colleague and I studied all the petitions that went to the White House during the Obama years. And if you add up all of the petitions that went to the Obama White House that were focused on the big domestic issues like healthcare, immigration, what else? Education, parental leave, taxation, all that stuff, that amounted to 5% of the petitions that went to the White House. So what was the rest? The rest was small frivolous things like the FDA should not regulate premium cigars, or jokes like our state should secede from the union, or things like the White House should recognize diaphragmatic hernia awareness day. And in fact, people in the highest income neighborhoods were most likely to sign a petition when they were about the most frivolous stuff. Okay, so issue after issue, behavior after behavior, it doesn't look like Americans who care about politics. Right? I'm talking about the people who say they care about politics, who say it's a civic duty to participate. Most of what they're doing is engaging in politics more like a hobby, like following sports, following the horse race. They're following gossip. They're feeling an emotional connection, and they're learning facts, but they're not themselves engaging in politics. So this book that I wrote has really 4 goals. The first one is to make this diagnosis. Most of us, and by the way, I put myself in this camp, are hobbyists. That is, we're doing politics like a hobby instead of like a means to getting power for the things we care about. The book's called Politics is for Power, which makes some people uncomfortable, the idea of power. What does that mean? All it means is that you're trying to get other people to take actions they wouldn't otherwise take, like vote or act or advocate. That's what politics is about, but for most of us it's not. Okay, so that's what the diagnosis is. The second goal is to say, where does this come from? There's a technology story, there's this important cultural story, so we can get more into this if you have questions about it, but the demographics of this are fascinating. The people who are learning the most facts and spending the most time on politics are college-educated white men. If you did a survey right now and you did a questionnaire and asked people factual questions about politics, like trivia questions, college-educated white men would by far know the most answers to those questions correctly. But if you look at the people who are actually participating in active politics, like they're volunteering for political organizations, you won't find that many college-educated white men. Who will you find? First of all, you'll find groups that are overwhelmingly led by and run by women. Since 2016 on the Democratic side, the indivisible groups and all the groups that have popped up have been about 2/3 women. You also see much more activism among racial minorities, particularly Blacks, but also Hispanics. That is, African Americans or Hispanics are spending less time learning facts and feeling connected to important things going on in Washington, and more time than college-educated white voters engaging in real volunteerism. So part of the story of hobbyism is about people who feel that politics is important, but they don't feel the stakes are high enough that they will get themselves off the couch. Okay, so where this comes from, there's a technological story and a cultural story. The third goal that I have in this book is to evaluate whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. Because a lot of people think that, well, if I'm engaging in hobbyism, as you call it, if I am following the news, aren't I doing better than the person who's not even doing that? Like, isn't it better than learning nothing? Like, half the country or more doesn't care about politics at all. Like, blame them. Why are you going after me? I'm like engaging in some way. But that's not right, and here's why. Because the political hobbyists are practicing the wrong skills and learning the wrong information, okay? So they're learning the wrong information because they're not actually learning about how they can be a citizen in their own community. And they're practicing the wrong skills because the kinds of things that people do, particularly online, or if they follow cable news, is a form of politics focused on provocation and outrage and attention seeking. And when you do politics for power, that is because you want other people to do something that come along with you, you have to do politics the way that you do every form of relationship building in your life, which is be patient, be empathetic, try to understand where people are coming from, right? If you want to convince someone at work or in your family, like a child, to do something, you generally can't do what we do online in politics, which is dismiss them, think in our heads that they're stupid and evil, which is exactly the kind of things that we do in politics, right? So we do politics in a sort of sports way where we call the other side stupid and evil and because we actually, it costs us nothing to do that because we're actually not trying to get anyone to do anything. But if you're doing politics in a real way, then you have to shift gears toward practicing a set of skills that focus on relationship building. All right, but politics as a hobby is even worse than that because we actually, as political hobbyists from the couch, make politicians behave badly. All right, and so you can see this most clearly in donations. Some people give low-dollar donations, and some of you might, if I had to ask you, like, which politician is the best politician at getting low-dollar donations, who would you say?
Bernie Sanders.
Bernie Sanders is who everyone says. Who said that? Cheryl. Bernie Sanders. Almost everyone, whenever I ask, says Bernie Sanders is the best at raising low-dollar donations, but that's not true. Who's the best at raising small dollar donations is Donald Trump. Right? So President Trump raised more money in low-dollar donations in 2016 than Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders combined. He raised more money in low-dollar donations than Obama did in 2012. And that's because the secret to raising low-dollar donations is to be very provocative and outrageous, and to say things that are going to make people feel relieved because you're screaming at someone on the other side. And so what we do on our couch, many of us who give a $5 donation, is we give it in response to seeing a viral video of someone taking the other side down, destroying someone. And this is bad for a number of reasons, but one reason it's bad is you can see in congressional hearings now or on the debate stage, every time politicians are in front of a camera, their goal is to make a viral video of themselves to get attention and dollars. And we, the people at home who are going to click and donate whenever we see something that's really makes us feel like satiated or catharsis of some kind, we're the ones that are encouraging politicians to do that. Okay, but here's the last thing I want to tell you, which is really the main goal of the book, is not to criticize all of us for being horrible hobbyists who are doing things all wrong, but to help tell us stories about people who are doing it right and help for us to find ways to do politics in our own lives better. And so some of you have heard me talk about Nach Visoki, who's one of the people I studied in my book, this old man in Boston who influenced 1,000 of his neighbors to vote. But let me tell you like another one or two quick stories from the book about people who are doing politics for power. That is, they're counting their own vote, the one that they're entitled to, and then they're trying to multiply it by getting other people to come on board with them. So one of these people in the book is a woman named Lisa, who's she's an architect in Brooklyn. Her kids are in high school, and she just about every weekend, maybe sometimes 2 or 3 times a weekend, goes over to Staten Island, which is a conservative area of New York. It was the only area to vote for President Trump. It had a Republican congressman up until 2018. And Lisa goes to the doors of people who she expects are Trump voters, registered Republicans. And she practices a form of politics called deep canvassing, which she goes and tries to have a listening, focused conversation with someone who's on the other side from her. She tells a story about herself, where she's coming from, why she feels the way she does about politics. She might talk about her in-laws who were Japanese, were interned in Japanese internment camps during World War II. She might talk about her kids who are biracial, and she might talk about anything personal in her life that gives her some understanding of politics and connects her values to a political choice. And then in a completely non-judgmental way, in a completely open way, she looks this voter in their eyes and invites them to tell her their story. Where do they come from? What do they think about politics? And when she does this in this non-judgmental, disarming way, the person on the other side often has this reaction that's like, oh, I thought you were going to yell at me. I thought this was a different conversation. I thought you were going to ask me to like regurgitate the talking points I heard last night on Fox News. But that's not what she's asking them to do. She's asking this person at the door to talk from their hearts. And sometimes those people have very different views than she has. And the worst case scenario for Lisa is that they come away maybe with some appreciation that this person at the door was nice to them. But a lot of times what happens is that she encounters people who voted a different way than she would have liked, but didn't really think it through that much. Didn't have a strong connection to that vote, and might be willing to change their minds. And this strategy that Lisa and her community uses has been shown to be one of the most effective ways to persuade someone in politics. Just one more quick story. There's a woman named Angela in this very conservative area of Pennsylvania I spent some time with. And what I like, Angela built a progressive organization in a very conservative Trump area of Western Pennsylvania because she felt really connected to healthcare issues. She was diagnosed with MS. She had a union. She's a nurse. Her union helped her get off time from work. And she really felt connected to the importance of healthcare, which got her activated into politics. But he takes a very long view because her area is so conservative. For her, they're not going to win the presidential election in Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania. So it's a slow and steady process. It's building one vote at a time, one local office at a time, convincing some voters a little bit at a time. And she does this in a similar way to Lisa, but not with talking to strangers. She does it in the most amazing way. When I was there visiting this group in Pennsylvania, I sat down at a table at their monthly meeting, and a gentleman joined us who just looked very different from everyone else. It was a strange setting. He was drinking a glass of wine, and he wore a T-shirt that said like "I love drinking" or something like that. And there was no alcohol being served at this thing. He just came in the room like that, and he introduces himself to this table and says, "I'm an evangelical Christian. I'm pro-life. My son's in the military. I voted for Trump." And people are shifting in their seats, like, what is this person doing here? And then he said, "I'm a Christian, and there's no such thing as a racist Christian, and I feel uncomfortable in the direction my community has taken." And this man who has never voted Democratic in his whole life, because because Angela has been so welcoming and made a point to check in with people and do the same kind of community building we do in a synagogue or anywhere, this guy is now not only voting for Democrats like Angela wants to, but canvassing and getting his own evangelical community on board. You know, and she just practices a form of politics that I find so appealing. You know, just one brief story about Angela. Right before coronavirus started, she told me she encountered someone out. She went to door knock to someone, stranger's house, and the person said, as soon as she knocked on the door, the person said, I hate paying taxes. Okay, that was the first thing. Imagine you're a progressive, a liberal canvasser in rural Pennsylvania, and you knock on someone's door, and they open the door and they say, "I hate paying taxes." How would you read that? Like, what would you do in that situation if you can imagine yourself there? Any takers?
I probably would say I agree.
Pam says I would agree. Okay. Anyone else?
I would have said the same thing.
That you agree?
I hate paying taxes too, but it's a necessary evil.
Yeah. So I'll tell you, my first intuition was to say, I probably should stop. I would feel like that person was saying, "Get off my lawn." You know, like I don't need to talk to you. I know what I think already, and you're here going to try to sell me on some big government plan, and that's why I'm telling you. That's why I'm telling you this. But Angela had the intuition that some of you had. She said, "I hate paying taxes too. I really hate paying taxes too." And then she said, "I hate paying taxes because I feel like I'm sacrificing so much. I'm a nurse. Our salaries aren't big, and yet our roads are still crumbling. And meanwhile, Amazon doesn't pay a cent in taxes." And she talks to a conservative voter and makes a connection to him about anger, real anger about paying taxes, and how that she directs that anger toward corporate tax policy, which she thinks is really unfair. And just like with the evangelical guy who was at the meeting I attended, this guy, who is also a very conservative voter, because Angela is very good at this, started working with the organization too. And so what I would say is that of all the stories in the book that I tell about people like this, they all have some things in common. They all are going from a form of politics in which they're trying to follow important news and pay attention to important stuff so they can have important conversations within friends about being important. And instead, they in their own lives are important. That is, they are important to other people, moving other people toward the politics that they want. So instead of being connected to important things, they're being important. They are seeing ways that they can multiply their own power of their vote, one voter at a time, and being a member of a community. So I would say that, you know, there's a lot in common with I think synagogue participation and real political participation. And as I say in the book, one of the ways you know you're engaging in politics as a hobby, as a shallow hobby, is that no one is depending on you. That is, if you stopped offering your hot takes on Facebook for a week or two, probably no one would call you up and say, "Kenny, enough." Oh, no, Kenny, we missed your hot takes. We couldn't live without them. Please come back, because the relationships on Facebook and Twitter, they aren't serious enough for that. But in real political organizations, just like in synagogues and any organizations, if you don't show up or someone doesn't see you in a while, they say, hey, we need you here, and where have you been? And so I think that, there's a lot in the book about how to do this, how organizations can do this, how political parties can help with this, but mostly it's about figuring out for any one of us, if we in our own lives look in the mirror and think we do politics more as a form of sports fandom or hobbyism, is there ways that we can redirect that to multiply the power of our own vote and move people along with us to get the political outcomes that are consistent with our values? And so let me stop there and open it up to any questions or comments or antagonisms of any kind.
Eitan, it's Toby. How you doing?
Good, how are you?
Good. So I want to speak just briefly about my mother, and then afterwards I want to talk to you about our social justice committee. Very briefly, I won't take over, but I just want to say that my mother, we grew up in Hartford, Connecticut, and my mother, just to give you an example, one day at school, one of the teachers said to my brother, oh, well, you can't fight City Hall. And he said, but my mother does it every week, which is true. We would go with my mother, and when everyone was leaving Hartford, Connecticut, I was the last white girl in my high school, and she put a sign on the lawn, this house is not for sale. By the way, that's why I went to Israel, because I was trying to do that high school. But anyway, so I grew up with a very active, very proactive mother from the Democratic Party. She was, we were very involved. All of my siblings are extremely involved now in politics, but none of our kids are. All of our kids are exactly what you've described in your book, armchair politicians, knowing a lot of information, but not really doing anything. So the next thing I just want to segue, and David Leach is here, and maybe he can speak more to this as well, but we have a wonderful, but inactive at this point, a little bit, I'm misnomer, it's not inactive, but we need more people on our social justice committee. And I know that people are interested. We've gone to the State House. We fought for against gun violence and fighting for immigrants. Right now, we're trying to put forth some information about donating to Amore, which is trying to help immigrants as well. And so I just want all of you to know, if you don't want to continue to be armchair politicians, we have a place for you at the Social Justice Committee. Thank you.
There you go. That's great. So I would say a couple things in reaction. One is there is a big problem of hobbyism among young people. It's true. By the way, the people spending the most time as armchair hobbyists are retirees, and including retirees who are in their in their 50s and 60s who have a lot of time, but that's where the most amount of hobbyism is. But you also see it very clearly in this younger generation. And what's happening there is that people say are 18 to 30. For one thing, they're delaying marriage and children a lot more than people in previous generations. Most people are not getting married till around 30. And that's a big change. And they're moving. So like they're moving every 18 months. And so they're very nomadic. And it's hard for some people in that demographic to feel like it's time for them to commit to a community. That's thing one. Thing two is you see a real divide on the Democratic side, young versus old. I mean, we've really never seen something quite like this in the Democratic primary that we just had, or that we're in the process of having, where young voters under 30 are voting Bernie Sanders over Biden like 4-1. And voters, the oldest voters, are doing the opposite. And what's going on there is that older voters tend to be pretty satisfied with, like, if you could just return the Obama administration on the Democratic side, that would be enough. Dayenu, like, bring back the Obama administration. And the younger voters say, like, we can't afford to buy a one-bedroom apartment. Like, we have bigger issues here. We have issues of immigration, on racial equality, on environment, on all sorts of things. And we want a lot more than bringing back the Obama administration. And I would say that the communities that I've interacted with and spent time interviewing with that have done best to resolve that tension are ones where two things are happening. One is that young people are part of the leadership of the organizations. So on the, whether it's a synagogue or church social justice committee, or it's a Democratic Party committee, the kids are not grunt workers. They are absolutely at the helm or at the helm with older participants in leadership. The second thing that's very common is that in the successful intergenerational organizations is that the younger voters are channeling their energy around a more activist stance through state and local engagement. That is, they might be voting for Bernie Sanders, say, because they want Medicare for all and the Green New Deal and all that. But the ways that they can channel that energy effectively is by pressuring their state and local governments to do that. And so if the older voters who tend to be dominating these organizations can make room for that, that tends to be the opportunity for that to be done well. I have another thing to say, but maybe I'll take more questions if anyone else has.
Yeah, I'll make an observation that I think my experience with Temple Social Action Committees very often is that they seem to focus more on hands-on type projects than trying to change government. I think more of something like in terms of the Jewish community, in terms of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs or some of those groups as being more wide-ranging in terms of their political attempts to influence politicians. But I have noticed in the last couple of years some very active younger Jews who are involved in here in Rhode Island, prison reform and gun violence and either on the right or the wrong side of Israel, depending on how you look at it. And a lot of young people I have seen out there working on those issues.
Yeah, I would say that in general, a lot of people make what I think is a mistake of putting in their heads that politics and community service are two different things. That they have a bin in their lives for politics, which is mostly like Democrats and Republicans fighting each other. And then they have a bin in their lives for charity and community service, which is helping people. But actually, I would say that every effective political organizer I know and have studied has a real merging of those two concepts. That is, the way to serve your community is not just through charitable work or social justice work, but it's through electing politicians and passing policy that helps people too. That actually politics and service are very, very connected. And not only are they connected because politics is a form of service, but the way to get political power is to build community, do community service. So, some of the, in the beginning of this book, I give an example that everyone here, I'm pretty sure, will be very uncomfortable with, which is an example from the 2018 election in North Carolina, where the Ku Klux Klan went around in North Carolina in 2018 and said, hey, do you have an opioid addiction? It's not your fault. We here at the White Knights of the KKK are here to help you through it. And you might think that the KKK just goes around in angry rallies or trying to promote, trying to convince people that white nationalism is a good thing. But that's not true. They're smarter than that. They recognize that the way to build political power is by looking people in the eye, empathizing with their concerns, and making that human connection, responding to some concrete trouble in their lives. And if the KKK is doing it, but like mainstream groups are not, then it won't be surprising which groups get power. It turns out that groups on the far extremes of both parties are very effective, not just at shouting about their ideology, which is what I think people in the middle find comfort in thinking, oh, like, you know, they're never going to get anywhere with that policy. That's not how it works. They're getting there because groups on the far left and far right are offering babysitting clinics, and they're offering opioid clinics and auto clinics, and they're doing stuff that meets people's needs. And so they've merged community service and political activism in their lives. And I think it's pretty important for a lot more people to do that too.
I have an issue about, or a question about activism at the state level.
Sure.
I've been involved with the Women's Fund of Rhode Island for the last 4 or so years. And what we have been working on are specific Rhode Island legislative issues. So whether it's getting a minimum wage increase passed, or whether it's getting leave for family illnesses, or whether it's last year, like everyone else, we were very involved with making sure that the state had a law that would support abortion even if Roe v. Wade was overturned, and so on. So what we work on a lot are local political initiatives through trying to influence our legislature by appearing at the State House, not just in numbers, although that's important too, but also in testifying on behalf of various bills. Now, I don't consider that to be hobbyist. I consider it to be activist, but it's still on the same issues for the most part that I would support and do support on the national level. So does it become non-hobbyist when you take an active role in trying to influence those same issues at the local or state level, where the legislatures have opportunities to actually be influenced versus in Washington, but it's still those same issues?
Yeah, some people are focused on different issues and some the same issues. I think people, particularly people who think they live in blue bubbles, have this idea that like everyone around them already agrees with them on all the issues that they care about. So if they're a Democrat, they might say, oh, my biggest issue is climate change, or my biggest issue is racial equality. That comes up a lot. And everyone here already agrees with me. After all, we're all voting for the same presidential candidate. But then if you were to start working on those issues locally, as you have done, you'll notice that it turns out you don't live in such a bubble after all. None of us do. And actually, if you're asking someone who's your neighbor who you think agree with you, or who's your legislator who you think agree with you, that maybe the state should maybe pay some economic cost to take some action or ruffle some feathers, all of a sudden you don't live in such a bubble. So it becomes real, I think, when you're doing politics in the way that you're describing. Let me also just say that there's it's sort of amazing at the state level. It's maybe not true, but at the local level it's true, which is that it's somewhat surprising how few people are really actually engaging in strategic political behavior. Last summer with my brother Ami at his camp, I took some of his staff. I did like a 5-day civic curriculum for the staff, and we went to the Ramapo zoning board. Now Ramapo is where like Muncie is, these very ultra-Orthodox community. And so the zoning board is like 2 African-American women, maybe in their 60s, and then 5 Haredi men, at least 2 or 3 of whom don't speak English much. It's mostly a Yiddish speaking environment that they're in. Okay, so I take the students there. The students have never been to a zoning board meeting. And we meet this woman, who I think her name was Susan. And we couldn't quite figure her out at first, but it turns out, here's what we learned, that this woman, Susan, who's just a regular citizen of this town, not religious, I don't know if she's Jewish or not, she goes once a week to the zoning board meeting for like 3 hours in the evening. And she goes there, and she has a position, which is basically to be the antagonist of the developers. Whatever the developers are proposing, she is opposing. And And she's learned over time all of the rules about how to muck the system up, how to stop the developers. And they all kind of hate her, it seems. But to give you a sense, at one point during the meeting, one of the developers stood up after Susan spoke, and he said, I have an announcement to make. For the first time in my life, I agree with Susan. And everyone laughs because they're all like in this together. And what was interesting taking the students there was seeing this example of political activism, which is actually very effective. This woman has a tremendous amount of power in her town, in the zoning board, which has a lot to do with, obviously against housing, which relates to the economy and the environment and racial issues and all that. And she's kind of a lone wolf actor, and yet just by basically spending an evening of her life once a week doing this, she's accumulated a ton of power. And the shift that I think the students made, which I was excited about, was that I'm pretty sure a lot of us here would learn about someone like this who goes once a week to a zoning board meeting and think, this is like a little meshuggah. Like who would, like, this is like, who does this? This is a strange way to behave. Meanwhile, the rest of us are basically like on Netflix every night. So like, who's crazy, right? She is the one who's actually using her time one evening a week to learn about how she can be involved in politics and taking some action. And she has power mostly because no one else is doing it. Any other thoughts or questions?
I have a question. What are the predictors of, college-educated white people who are involved in politics in this way? From what I've seen sort of anecdotally, one of them definitely is living in the same place for more than 30 seconds, right? Like when I've been a couple times to the zoning board meetings in Boston, right? Like the people who actually get things done are the people who are like, well, 30 years ago, we had this conversation when this business wanted to move in there. And then 20 years ago, we had it again, and we're not gonna have the, they go on and on. They have a long history and they know all their neighbors, not just because they're neighbors, but because like their father was this kid's dentist and, my brother went to school with her sister.
No, you would never find that kind of thing in Providence.
Nor in Brockton, the old country. But there's like a certain amount of stability or like staying in one place that's needed for this, right?
So I would say for leadership in something like this, I would say the organizers who are leading a lot of the really effective communities are people who are going to be in the community for a long time. But there is all these people who are doing incredibly important service roles who are not that type. For example, there is in this community in Westmoreland, Pennsylvania, there's a bunch of people from the community who are knocking on doors all the time, but the community is really spread out. And so they need drivers to drive the canvassers around. And some people are there to be drivers, and some people are there to be in the background, providing resources. During these moments like this, or during the government shutdown a couple of years ago, this group was out passing out diapers and gas cards and all sorts of stuff. And there's just a ton of people in the background. There's a Latino coalition that I studied in the book from Haverhill, and it's almost entirely Dominican and Puerto Rican members, leaders of the organization, but there are also a bunch of, white allies who are there, but they're in the background. And so I think that a lot of younger people, or people who are not going to be around a community for forever, can still do a lot of work as support for organizations that are taking these actions. Or just, you go to on something like zoning, in a lot of communities like around Boston, there's still like, if 30 people show up to a zoning board meeting for something, that's like unheard of. And all of a sudden, like the way zoning works, right, is that like, if there's some new construction project, building 100 units somewhere, there will be 1,000 comments, public comments about that, and 100% of them will be negative. So if you are interested in building more, dense living environments, like there's no one doing it. There's no one going to a zoning board meeting and saying like, hey, yeah, we actually should build. Everyone is always against. And so if 30 people show up, even if they're not going to be long-term people, and say like, hey, we actually like this, that makes a huge difference. So, if that's the kind of issue that's important. Questions, comments?
Well, it's Charlie again. I just feel a little frustrated for our social justice committee because really, we need more people to help. We have the same people who have been involved for many years. We don't have any of the young folks from our synagogue. Eitan, do you have any suggestions? How do people get more young folks or anybody interested in helping? Some of the kind of activities that we do, we need more people to help out.
Yeah, so I think number one is like, what issues do they care a lot about? Obviously I think in a Jewish community right now, immigration is at the forefront of a lot of people's minds. And I think for younger people, clearly the environment is very focused on people's mind and feeling like, what are we gonna do about this? And so I think that putting younger people again in leadership positions to help direct the focus of what a social action committee does is a good step. But by young people, I actually mean like teenagers and people even before they leave for college. People obviously like people who have young kids. I would say the activism that I see around my own community in Brookline that's focused on local politics is focused primarily on the environment and on housing. And what's interesting about something like housing is that it merges some kind of self-interested engagement, like I want to be able to afford a house, with affordable housing issues that are tied to racial justice, right? So when you're involved, when you're engaged in like discussions of affordable housing, you're talking about lowercase a affordable housing, which is like an apartment that my family could afford. And you're talking about capital A affordable housing, which is like government sponsored affordable housing for low-income families. And there's a ton of stuff going on that's overlap between those two communities. And so once you get people involved in one, you get them connected to another too. So I think in some ways it's about finding those synergies, but particularly for the youngest people, for like high school students, my experience, and this comes in part from growing up at Temple Emanu-El and being a USY leader at Temple Emanu-El, is that young people, and I see this in my students too, can really sniff out when they're being used. And a lot of, I'm absolutely not saying this about the Social Action Committee, but in general, I think a lot of students feel like when they're invited to do something by like an older community or by their community, they're being used in a way, like if someone wants a warm body or a group of young people, and they're not being empowered in a leadership way. And so I would think about, is there ways to do that more? Because students want to be in leadership positions for all sorts of reasons. One is for resume building, but also because like they want to be able to, say that when they apply to college, but they also want it because they want mentorship and they want to figure out how they can make things happen. And there's a lot that they can make things happen at a local level. And I think so giving them more control over that and focusing everything at the synagogue, from social action to religious engagement to anything, on leadership development of kids is kind of a central mission.
I would
All
say
right,
that we're lucky.
let's talk.
Yes.
I would say
Yeah.
that we're very fortunate to live in a state the size and scale of Rhode Island. I know it hurts us in terms of how many electoral college votes we get, but by the same token, it also means that it's not like you have to stay overnight to go to Albany or to Austin. It's close by, it's attainable, it's accessible. We live in neighborhoods where our legislators are local people who we can meet when we go out for a walk, where we meet our governor when we go out for a walk. And those kinds of things help make it accessible, especially to young people. I know that was true with my own kids growing up here. They got to know politicians first name basis because they were growing up in a place where people were accessible and where you could meet, where the mayor came and threw out the first pitch at your Little League game.
So I just want to wrap it up because I want to be mindful of Eitan's time. Did you want to respond, Eitan, before I totally wrap it up?
No, I think that's right. I mean, I think one thing I would say is that a lot of people, when they think about what's wrong with politics today, are very quick to blame some faraway forces, the Electoral College, gerrymandering, money in politics, something that is conveniently not their responsibility or fault. But you know what this book is about is trying to help us think about how our own role could change within the system that we have to think about politics differently, not as this like unfolding drama we're witnessing as viewers, but like but a form of politics where we are actually active participants. And I think what you're saying, Diane and Toby, is like there are actually tons of opportunities to do this. There's opportunities at the shul, there's opportunities in Providence, in Rhode Island, and the main impediment is actually more of us just realizing like we have a role to play here. And with that, let me,
Before you wrap up, Eitan, I have one question. So I have a question about social media and political influence. Is there any point to citizens, for example, tweeting about things or in reply to things?
I would say basically not. There's, I mean, that is all about getting something off our chest or trying to, trying to express ourselves as opposed to trying to move someone else. I mean, we know that to move someone else is hard, to change someone's behavior, to ask someone to do something, like really a thing, like go vote for this particular person. And online, we just don't, it's in theory possible to like have, you know, a relationship in writing or on the internet that is a deep relationship. But generally speaking, when we're talking about Facebook and Twitter, we're talking about very shallow relationships where like our goal when reading something that someone else is writing is to like read it in the least generous way possible so that we can score points. And so if you've ever been in a debate online, it probably had this flavor, like, how do I read this person's comment in the least generous way possible? Whereas if you're talking to people in the way that Angela and Lisa and the people in my book that I study talk to people, they do the opposite. They do like the Menchie thing, which is like, how do I find the best thing in this person is saying? And they do that not just because they're nice people, but because they know the way to persuade someone to do something is by extending that kindness and generosity and empathy so that they might come along with them. And so I think the social media stuff, we're just like practicing exactly the wrong skill set usually for real politics.
All right, with that, I think we're gonna wrap up. Eitan has generously agreed to come back in about a month to do some wrap up. And do you want to say anything about your follow-up?
I don't know what the follow-up is, but anyone who wants to, if you want to read the book and come back, we can talk about it and even make more concrete plans for how people can be engaged. By the way, I should say, if in case this has been, I think a lot of the comments and some of my own book has been focused on the political left. But if you there behind your screens are on the political right, we could also talk about that too. There's a lot of interesting differences and similarities about activism on both sides.
Thank you. And just so everyone knows, we've recorded this. I think we'll probably share it with the community maybe next week before Pesach. But thank you so much, Eitan, for all of your wisdom and sharing everything that you had to share with us tonight. So thank you.
Thank you all for spending an hour with us tonight. I really
Yes,
appreciate it.
Awesome.
Okay, take care,
Bye,
everybody.
everybody.
Laila Tov.